just to do a quick intro to this, Gail has recently started writing a Western trilogy. Gail is someone who's written tons of books, lots of science fiction, fantasy, probably steampunk, horror, you name it. But until this trilogy she's starting, she'd never really written full-length Westerns. And so as a genre fiction writer, the question I guess would be like, what did you find different about writing a Western? Like, what was challenging or in a different way? And I know you mentioned just now that the research is definitely part of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got to do your research because you don't want to, especially anachronisms, you want to make sure that the gun that your character is carrying has been invented during the time period that you're writing him in. So that kind of stuff. And one of the one thing that really hit me, the train system, the Transcontinental Railway, that was kind of the TARDIS of the 19th century, because in a lot of ways it conquered space and time. If you figure before the trains, it took 6 months to either go around the tip of South America and reach California from the East Coast, or 6 months to travel across by wagon train. When the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, it took 8 days.
Wow.
From 6 months to 8 days. And that was an astonishing technological advancement.
Yeah.
And it changed everything. Suddenly, vast places were open.
You were pretty likely to live all of those 8 days, where going around the Horn or going across in the wagon train, let's face it, lots of people died on the Oregon Trail.
High mortality rate, as we know.
Yes.
Going the ocean route, too. So in 8 days, I mean, Robert Louis Stevenson went on an immigrant train in about 1880, and he had tuberculosis and was bone thin, and he got there. He was pretty puny, but he got there.
And he would never have made that journey, over land.
Or by sea. He just would not have. So that literally transformed the way and opened up vast sections of the country. So you can see how it mythologized the West. And then you had things like the dime novel writers, Ned Buttline and all the others, that were creating all these fantastic historical characters based on fact, but doing astonishing things. And of course, the guy who worked as a clerk in New York City wanted to go out and try his hand, and then the gold rush. So really, in a lot of ways, it's genre fiction, yes, and it's almost science fiction fantasy. You're settling a new planet in many ways. So when I think of it that way, suddenly, oh, okay, it's science fiction only set in the 1900s in the American West. So boom.
Yeah, I love that because I don't think most people realize that. See those commonalities between westerns and say sci-fi fantasy. But yeah, like you said, they're on a new planet basically. It's like they're colonizing an alien world.
Yes.
Well, there's always the conflict between the greenhorn, the Easterner, the person who is so terribly out of their depth. They don't have the least survival skills. And if you and I were transferred to Mars, we die. I mean, we die. So, yeah, that's where that Easterner, Westerner genre conflict, content genre works. It's not about the setting, but it's about is the individual the hero or the villain for the society. And we like for him to be the hero or her, but
and then
an indigenous species already there.
Yes.
The Native Americans and the tribes differed so much, and this was communicating with almost in a different species in many ways. So that whole kind of learning to communicate, learning to get along or not, that's fascinating for telling stories. But then again, you've got people doing stuff, which is basically everything we write about is people going out, getting into trouble, getting out of trouble, meeting interesting people. So we just, they've got 6 guns instead of blasters, but they're still fun to write.
Well, and kind of like you alluded to, those culture clashes, a clash of civilizations is every bit as interesting as any sort of first contact you would read about in a sci-fi novel too.
Yes, it is. It is literally. And so often it was first contact.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely first contact. And it's fascinating to read the stories of that, the cross-cultural thing, the old, the women go and were taken away and joined the tribe. There's a lovely story about a woman who had these facial tattoos when she was living with a tribe of Native American. And then when she was rescued and taken back to her culture, she didn't want to go. And 2, she was pretty much, this is what I've been. Look at this. She's marked for the rest of her life. So it's interesting to look at pictures of her in these elaborate dresses and a bustle with tattoos on her face. That's fascinating. That kind of cultural clash and cultural blend is just fascinating to explore in stories.
Now, when you were researching it, because I imagine, I could see trying to get maybe not necessarily research every single aspect, because obviously you can go overboard. But at the same time, I would imagine if you don't research enough, like let's say if I don't research guns of the Old West and I just refer to my characters using a rifle or a gun, that probably a lot of readers would probably get put off because, that kind of takes away from the believability of it. You want to know, it really does matter, what kind of gun your protagonist is using is going to affect the range of their fire and, what they can do and all that. So what did you find yourself? Obviously guns are one area, but what other areas of researching the Old West did you kind of focus on?
Well, you want to be careful if your hero is carrying a Spencer rifle or a Henry rifle or a Peacemaker Colt or this or that, but also what they wore, what they ate is fascinating. You jump on a horse and go travel for days and days. What are you carrying with you to eat? What are you carrying with you for your horse to eat? And it was fascinating to look at, say, when the soldiers are out there, say Custer, going on some of those heading towards Little Bighorn, how much fodder did they carry for their horses? What kind? That kind of stuff, all of that kind of, and then how quickly can they go from one place to the other? There were railroads, but this is a big country with a lot of thin lines of rail tracks through it. And in between, you had stagecoaches. The Concord stagecoach was an astonishing piece of technology built in Concord, Massachusetts, I think. And they would literally last for decades. They had some that they had transported over on ships, and the ship sank in San Francisco Bay. They got it back out a year later, dried the Concord stage out, and it ran for another 70 years. They were a beautiful piece of machinery. So that kind of stuff is fascinating to me, and fascinating characters. One woman that I use in my first book is based on Mrs. Sarah Boganis, who was a 6 foot tall, 300-pound prostitute who was breveted a lieutenant colonel for her aid in a siege of a fort and was buried with full military honors. And her nickname was the Great Western because that was the biggest ship afloat at the time. Fascinating. Those kind of stories just make wonderful detail and background.
Something else you have to work with. Think about the technological state of the world in 1800. Not talking about in the West, but in England, which is where the Industrial Revolution is cranked up, and the developments by 1870, those 70 years. That's kind of like 1900 to 1970. Except they were inventing concepts that we take for granted. The telegraph. You could get a message across the country in, maybe a day. They did have to repeat them.
Relays.
Yeah. Still, and the technology. I understand that they actually ran wire from the telephone poles down into the ground every so often. That increased the amount of electrical energy that went across the understand how that works. But they thought of it. They figured that out.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, a lot of the what we think of as the modern world taking shape, a lot of people think of that happening in the 20th century, but it really most of that happened in the 19th century, where that's where things started to exponentially develop.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Things that we built on after that to create what we have today. Fascinating. So
well,
fascinating.
it sounds like, yeah, it sounds like writing a Western is something. So to all those writers out there who write in other genres, you should really think about Westerns. And there's a lot more commonality between Westerns and the rest of genre fiction than most people realize.
and if you don't believe it, watch Firefly.
Amen.